You stand here and now, in this moment of world history, between the hope of heaven and prospect of hell, such as you have never even dreamed before. However, if matters of that sort with which we deal in this report are to be seen, it were suitable that there be no harsh battle cries, but that what must be said is said in those quiet tones of deadly earnest used by the commanders of the troops on the early morning of the day the greatest war was to begin. It is not the wild passions of the drunken mob, but the chillingly quiet cadence with which the cavalryman steadies his mount, and commanders calm their charges at times when the unthinkable is, at last, actually, finally, to begin. Therefore, as I have just promised you that I would, I will speak calmly of things which men should remember in the aftermath of the great battle now coming on. Heed these words calmly, that you might hear them with an open mind. For if you can accept calmly the reality of what I report to you here, we were all more likely to make the decisions to which we survive this presently oncoming general breakdown crisis of present society worldwide.
Weeks had long passed since a crew of Genoese sailors set sail from the port of Caffa on the Black Sea. Their destination, Messina, Sicily. They had brought with them promises of great riches from both Asia and the Eastern Islamic peoples to offer in trade to the Western world. The merchant ships overflowed with the finest of Chinese silks, spices, gold, and decorative plates, pots, and vases. And so, despite the long journey, the men were merry, working long and hard to reach their destination. However, midway through the journey, many of the crew members began to feel quite ill, putting the blame on seasickness. "Ah," gestured one of the sailors, "for we are men of the ocean, and in all the years that I have sailed from the Mediterranean towards the Black Sea and round about, we have never been overwhelmed by seasickness. Quit squabbling like ladies and come. Let us sail with vigor in anticipation of the prize and payment that awaits us at the end of this voyage." They pulled together and sailed on. Symptoms vanished as they downed drink upon drink, tossed rats into the waters, and sung joyful songs about their great employers in Venice. By fall of October 1347, the crew finally reached shore, dropping anchor near the port of Messina. As they unloaded boxes of gold and spices from China, the townspeople gathered round closely, watching in curiosity as they usually did when new cargo had arrived. Many took notice of black blotches on the skin of the sailors, many of whom also had swellings the size of an apple or egg around their armpits and necks, which oozed pus and blood. Those people of Messina who saw these blemishes chuckled amongst themselves, saying, "What violent men! Their stupidity and arrogance prevents their comradeship. They have obviously been fighting each other. Look at their bruised bodies. Have they nothing better to do while traveling across the oceans?" The people of Messina continued on to their business as the sailors finished unloading the cargo. Then the sailors greeted and embraced friends they hadn't seen since they left, and they drifted off into the city for food, drink, and pleasure. At sunrise, the merchant owners of the trading ships made their way to the newly arrived vessel with details of its new assignment. As they jumped on board, they found that all the oarsmen lay dead. That same day, many people turned up with identical swellings, with boils that spread across their bodies and black blotches from internal bleeding. They suffered severe pain as their skin decayed even as they still lived, and they died within 5 days from the first sign of symptoms. The disease spread like fire across dry hills as more and more caught the infection. Boils and swellings were replaced with a constant spitting of blood and a tremendous fever. They coughed violently, sweated heavily, and died in 3 to 4 days or sometimes within 24 hours. By this time, everything which excreted from their bodies, sweat, breath, bloody vomit, bloody urine, and bloody blackened feces, penetrated the air with a foul stench. Those who went to bed healthy died before they woke. Doctors who cared overnight for the sick were found by morning lying dead on top of their patient. The Black Death, rumored to have depopulated the whole of India, to have left no survivors in China or any other place where the plague had swept, such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Asia Minor, had now come to feast on Europe. The pest was the bubonic plague, which spread through the bite of fleas carried by rats. It infected the bloodstream and caused the lymph nodes to hemorrhage. As the bacterium spread to the lungs, it would become the more virulent pneumonic plague, transmitted from human to human through the medium of air. One cough from a victim of plague was enough to infect nearly everyone in sight. The rapid spread of this death was horrifying for both those yet to be infected and those who were already victims, for people knew of no prevention or cure. Thus, as the pest unmercifully wiped out mother, child, father, brother, and sister, all Europe contemplated the words engraved upon the gates of Dante's Inferno, "Abandon all hope, all ye who enter here." They believed they were witnessing the end of the world. 3 months after the encounter in Messina, the plague, moving intimately within merchant ships, hit Florence and Rome as it simultaneously landed in the seaport near Marseille and Montpellier in France, and then navigated up the Rhone River into Avignon. By early summer, Paris and Lyon met the pestilence face to face as it spread into Normandy, then crossed the Channel to infect southern England, as it simultaneously leapt above the Alps from Italy to attack Switzerland. Within 4 years, the disease hit all of Western Europe, striking Russia by 1351. The bacterium spread to Flanders through Paris, attacked Scotland, spread from Iceland both to Greenland and to Norway, where a boat, shipping wool, landed on the shores of Bergen with a cargo load of the disease. No men were found alive. In Avignon, nearly 400 died daily, and the city's graveyard received 11,000 corpses in the span of 6 weeks. As the grave sites filled, bodies were thrown into the river until mass burial or common pits were created. But despite the effort, bodies piled up until they overflowed. It killed so rapidly that many were left unburied, as the proportion of the dead exceeded the living. It killed faster than the Compagnia della Misericordia in Florence could cart away the dead, leaving corpses lying in the streets and doorways. Families were left alone to dispose the corpses of their relatives whom they buried in great haste, in graves so shallow that dogs dragged them forth and devoured their bodies. Fearful priests left the dying to die without prayer, granting permission to laymen to hear confessions. If no men were in sight, then confess to a woman, they said. Such scenes brought deep sorrow to observers. One Angelo di Torre of Siena recorded,
"Father, abandoned child. Wife, husband. One brother, another. This plague seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died. And no one could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. And I, Angelo di Tura called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And so did many others."
As the death rate accelerated, it drove men mad. Doctors fled from science, turning towards astrology for answers. Using mathematical calculations, but caring nothing for the actual cause of this calamity, they declared to Philip IV that the triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars was the culprit. Scotsmen rejoiced, hearing that England had been afflicted, and laughed at their enemies as they planned an invasion. They gathered their horses, wielded their swords, prepared their archers, and armed their forces. But before they could attack, the plague came upon them too, killing some and leaving the rest to spread it. Archbishop Giovanni Visconti of Milan ordered the doors and windows sealed of the first 3 plague-stricken houses, entombing the healthy, the sick, and the dead. But even this was not the peak of insanity. As the mortality rose, twittering cults called flagellants emerged. Claiming divine inspiration, they gathered in groups of 200 to 300, or even up to 1,000, going from town to town as they scourged themselves with iron-spiked whips. Death and destruction were their only followers. They swarmed upon townships, burning those of Jewish descent alive under the accusation of having caused the world's sufferings, stole from the altars of churches, and left nothing but the plague in their wake. This combination of pandemic and cults forced town and country to shut their borders, as was done in Poland. The trading of wool and linen was forbidden. Natives who had left for any reason were denied re-entry. If they lacked the means to reside elsewhere, they were forced to live far from the gates.
We can imagine men fleeing to the hills away from their towns and villages to escape this enemy of mortals. Without pause, they run until they reach the hilltop, thinking, here is safety, since no men live nearby. From there, they look down across the chaos engulfing their neighbors, brothers, and sisters. They can see no cause, but only death. Gasping for air from the rapid journey, as they fled their vanishing society, they try to think, but horror allows only one word to come to their mind. Why? Why?
Deep in the 100,000 years of the last ice age, mankind traveled the great oceans of the world, navigating by the stars. He mastered the great cycles of the heavens, the solar day, the ever-changing seasons of the solar year, and he came to know even very long cycles, such as the 25,000-year precession of the equinox and the apparent movement of the sun against the backdrop of the 12 great constellations of the zodiac. Near the end of the last ice age, when the melting ice caused the sea to rise by 400 feet, man began to settle inland up the course of great rivers. Accounts given by Plato and others tell us that out of this process arose the great civilization of Egypt, which built the pyramids to observe the stars. Egypt, in turn, sponsored the rise of the classical Greece of Homer, Aeschylus, the Pythagoreans, Socrates, and Plato. These men and their associates produced the most powerful art and science the world had yet seen. For the first time in history, the systematic notion of ideas, of the development of ideas, and therefore of the creative processes of the human mind itself, took center stage. But tragically, within that humanist culture were sown the seeds of its eventual destruction. Diodorus Siculus tells the story of another settlement of these astrogators, these people of the sea as they were known. They established a colony which had a ruler with several sons by a concubine named Olympia. The eldest, Zeus, led the Olympians as they were known in revolt and established a tyranny throughout the maritime settlements of most of the Mediterranean. The Olympians portrayed themselves as gods, as an imperial oligarchy destined to rule forever over a subservient, enslaved mankind. The great playwright Aeschylus depicted the nature of this fight best in his Prometheus trilogy. He wrote this drama to expose their evil. Evil because the Olympian oligarchy suppressed the natural creative powers of mankind and their power to do good. Evil has no self-evident existence. Only the good exists as a positive universal force. Evil is merely the attempt to negate this good, to suppress and restrain the natural course of upward human progress. At times, this force of evil can succeed in shackling the good even for very long periods of time, and can spread terrifying destruction for the whole of mankind as a result. But it itself is also destroyed, self-consumed, driven to destruction by a bitter hatred for natural human goodness. Thus, determined to end this imperial hell, Aeschylus, the great fighter of the Persian Empire, with his Prometheus, declared that man's true mission was to free himself from this oligarchy, for he knew that man was made in the image of the Creator, and that man's purpose in life was to assist in the process of creation. Prometheus understood and committed himself to defend that.
But hearken to the miseries that beset mankind, how that they were witless erst, and I made them to have sense and be endowed with reason. Nor will I speak to upbraid mankind, but to set forth the friendly purpose that inspired my boons. First of all, though they had eyes to see, they saw to no avail. They had ears, but understood not. But, like to shapes in dreams, throughout their length of days, without purpose, they wrought all things in confusion. Knowledge had they neither of houses built of bricks and turned to face the sun, nor yet of work in wood, but dwelt beneath the ground like swarming ants in sunless caves. They had no sign either of winter, or of flowery spring, or of fruitful summer, whereon they could depend, but in everything they wrought without judgment, until such time as I taught them to discern the rising of the stars and their settings, ere this ill distinguishable. Aye, and numbers too, chiefest of sciences, I invented for them, and the combining of letters, creative mother of the muses' art, wherewith to hold all things in memory. I too first brought brute beasts beneath the yoke to be subject to the collar and the pack saddle, that they might bear in men's stead their heaviest burdens. And to the chariot I harnessed horses, and made them obedient to the rein, to be an adornment of wealth and luxury. 'Twas I, and no one else, that contrived the mariner's flaxen-winged car to roam the sea. Wretched that I am, such are the inventions I devised for mankind, yet have myself no cunning wherewith to rid me of my present suffering. Hear the sum of the whole matter in the compass of one brief word. Every art possessed by man comes from Prometheus.
Zeus and the Olympian gods were enraged by the action taken by Prometheus, and so condemned him to an eternal torment. All empires like Babylon, Persia, the rule of the Greeks under the Delphic Temple of Apollo, Rome, Venice, and then the British are all based on this Olympian model. Empires have preyed upon different peoples, but always operate on the same principle. Yet, empires cannot stop one like Prometheus, for his mission was to free mankind, to give him science. By this, man knew it was his mind that made him superior to the animals. But to express such compassion towards man had its known risk. As the cruelty of Zeus demonstrated, the oligarchical forces depended upon an unchanging state of man as a beast. And so, our story begins over 2,000 years ago. In an attempt to extend the monetarist maritime empire of Persia into Europe through the Mediterranean, their financial center, the Apollo Temple at Delphi, orchestrated the Peloponnesian War between Athens, Corinth of Sparta, and their allies to the ruin of all. Through the alliance of oppressed people, however, the power of Persia was not able to extend further west than the Greek mainland. But, with Alexander the Great entering the stage of history, he had decided that it was no longer acceptable to only tame the empire, but to destroy it. Alexander, as the authority over Athens, went ahead and organized the Egyptians to rise with him to bring about the destruction of Tyre. They joined forces and together brought down not only the existing eastern empire of the oligarchy, but sabotaged the plot to expand throughout the West in their attempt to establish global imperial dominance. And for that, he was struck down by poisoning at the direction of Aristotle. Though not an unusual habit, the ruling families throughout the Mediterranean from that time on remained at each other's throats, seeing that they could not agree on where to locate their imperial center, until the priesthoods of Mithra and the Temple of Apollo deployed unto the Isle of Capri with the intent of fulfilling the centuries-long desire to establish a unified empire ruling east and west. There the representatives of evil came upon an agreement. Rome was to be the capital, and one of those present at the meeting, Octavius Caesar, was anointed the first emperor of Rome as Augustus. Characteristic of the deal that was struck, the successor of Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, sent forth orders from Capri to crucify Jesus of Nazareth. Rome's institutional base of power continued to be that practice of monetarism, which was still centered at the Temple of Apollo. This vast control was made easy by Rome's intentional degradation of its own population. It had created a culture of bread and circuses, a population which loved to engage in various sexual perversions. The Roman Imperium dictated over 200 holidays a year, keeping the population in a perpetual state of stupidity. But within a few centuries, the territories of Rome would be destroyed by its own looting policies, forcing Emperor Constantine in 330 AD to move his imperial capital into the much richer regions of the east, inaugurating the Byzantine Empire to replace and continue that of Rome. As the doom of the Western Empire was pending, hordes of barbarians swept with the sword into northern Italy. The Visigoths, Huns, the Vandals all sunk their teeth into the dying predator, sacking Rome itself in 410 and again in 455 AD. Terrorized by the invasions, some of Rome's remaining noble families gathered what wealth and property they could carry with them and fled north. They found a place of refuge from the carnage they themselves had created within the armpit of Italy upon a swampy lagoon. Although they fled in desperation, leaving much behind, their ruling class identities were not sacrificed in the journey.
God, who is our help and protection, has saved us in order that we may dwell upon these watery marshes. This Venice, which we have raised in the lagoons, is a mighty habitation for us. No power of emperor or prince can reach us save by the sea alone, and of them we have no fear.
Thus, Venice became the place of refuge of the fleeing nobility, but had not its capital, until Angelo of the rolling Bador family placed the canals, the bridges, and the ducal palace upon the sewer. During this time, Byzantium still assumed it was a power, but as the centuries went on, the oligarchy, which ran the empire through the control of money and the organization of money, leaned more and more on Venice as their center of imperial activity.
When in 1000 the Byzantine Empire underwent a fundamental crisis, that was the period when Venice started to take over more and more of Europe, and eventually the power center shifted to the financial oligarchy in Venice. So then in 1066 the Normans took over England and the Saxons got defeated, and then eventually Venice for a very long time remained the power center of the imperial structure. So you are really looking at a succession of different empires. Now naturally Venice in this period, in this long period, underwent changes, family changed, replaced others, but the oligarchical structure essentially remained the same.
Centuries had passed from the day the ruling families left Rome, and the Venetians rapidly asserted a maritime dominance that no one could or would dare to challenge. Recognizing her might, the Istrians begged Venice for protection from Slavic pirates. This protection was granted gracefully, at the price of 100 jars of wine per year. Though her mother, Byzantium, interfered with her desire of controlling a global financial maritime empire, as Byzantium still controlled the trade routes of the East, Venice overcame these circumstances and managed to secure trading privileges over Byzantium's territories. They accomplished this by making the emperor fearful of foreign attack, an attack which Venice herself was well equipped to foment. The 20 to 30 rolling Venetian families prided themselves on being descendants of the imperial Rome of Caesar, but whether they were really related by flesh or not, they were descendants of Rome's imperial ideology, for this oligarchy was clearly committed to the ancient model that created Rome, and were determined to ensure that Venice would embody empire.
Be thou unique in the isolation of thy sight. None shall resemble thee. In thy freedom from pope and emperor, none shall rival thee. The city thou buildest on the ooze of the lagoon shall outlast the rock-built cities of the crag and the broad-laid cities of the plain. Out of thine incessant combat with the sea shall come thy strength. Thy soul shall delight in beauty, and beautiful shall be thy handiwork.
Of course, anything that could come from the handiwork of Venice would be anything but beautiful. Her handiwork was one of dumping many into wars, while making them believe that the Venetians were really their ally, and that they shared common interest. Like its descendants in the British Empire of today, Venice had no permanent allies, only permanent interests. To gain her interests, emperors and kings were to play her game, and if they refused or retaliated, they would simply meet their doom. Byzantium was one significant force that chose not to play her game. This was troublesome, for without Constantinople she would lose access to the Black Sea and all the treasures that lay in Asia and the Middle East. Ultimately, Constantinople did fall to the Venetians, not by her own hand, but by the hand she manipulated.
The Venetians are very good at psychological warfare as well. That if you read Friedrich Schiller's Ghost Seer, you can see that what you do is you pretend to be people's friends. You find out what they want, what their weakness is, and you give it to them. If they want money, you give them money. If they want sex, you arrange for that. If they want drugs, you arrange for that. Whatever it is they want, their weakness is, you feed them. And then you tell them, okay, I'm doing all this for you and I just need these little favors. And you corrupt them. And you corrupt them until you can control them. And of course, you know what they're doing, so you can always blackmail them if they try to get out of line. But basically what controls them is the knowledge that if they don't go along with you, then they lose out on all these things they like. You know, if they play ball with you, then they become rich, they become famous, They have all of their desires sated. They get everything that they want, but in a mental state which is increasingly depraved and subject to manipulation. And that's also the Venetian method, that you win by corruption. And that the thing that the empire fears most of all is an honest man who isn't corruptible because he doesn't want those things.
"15 years after Pope Gregory VII undertook major reforms, establishing ultramontane rule over all kingdoms of Europe, Pope Urban II delivered an infamous sermon at the Council of Clermont, consolidating the rule and issuing the orders to crusade, to retake the Holy Lands from the non-believers. Thousands of men, depraved and deprived of knowledge, were convinced to partake in the satanic expedition, as they were promised full exemption from civil jurisdiction and remission of sins. And so they embarked, thousands of them, mercilessly looting and ravishing all in sight, fearing nothing, for all was forgiven. Although they slayed in Christ's name, as they came closer to victory, the one they served as Lord became ever clearer. After the Norman chivalry conquered Jerusalem, envoys were sent to Venice to report the good news. Venice, in turn, immediately sent their own fleets against the weakened Islamic army to capture the ports of Jaffa and Haifa, vital to her own commercial interests. As they prepared to conquer the cities of Tyre and Ascalon decades later, the Crusaders unhesitatingly gave their offerings to their god. A third of each city was allotted to the oligarchy. And it was ensured that within all the kingdoms of the Crusades, a bakery, a bath, a market, and a free quarter were given to the Venetians. They would be exempt from all taxation, while the Christian king of Jerusalem would pay them a tax of 300 bezants annually. The chivalry, with permission by the papacy, went as far as to proclaim that wherever a Venetian went, their law should follow them, for no law was higher than Venetian law. The only problem the oligarchy encountered in sponsoring these religious wars was that her strategic privileges within Constantinople were threatened. Alexius I of the Byzantine Empire was against the expedition of the Crusaders because they threatened Byzantium's own territories, so he demanded that Venice withdraw. For the rest of the 12th century, measures were taken against Venice by Constantinople, such as the order sent forth by the emperor on March 7, 1171, to arrest and imprison every Venetian within Byzantium's domain. This demonstrated to the oligarchy that her mother was no longer going to play her game, which was troublesome, for without access to the Black Sea, it would be difficult for Venice to secure maritime dominance. All the treasure that lay in the lands of India and China were necessary for Venice to complete her puzzle of extended monetarist practice worldwide. But these crafty devils had no need to fear. A plot lay ready for them to seize as soon as the opportunity arose. At the turn of the 12th century, Saracens waged war to retake the Holy Land from the Norman chivalry. The barons of France and Flanders immediately sent 6 messengers to plead to their birth mother, knowing that only with Venice could they defend themselves. They assembled at St. Mark's, where the ambassadors pleaded to the oligarchy.
Sirs, the most exalted and puissant of the barons of France have sent us to you, and they beg your favor, that you may be seized with pity for Jerusalem, which is in bondage to the unbelievers, and that for God's sake you will consent to aid them to avenge the shame of Jesus Christ. And they have chosen you, because they know that no people on the sea has so great power as you. And they bade us to fall at your feet, and not to rise until you grant that you will have pity on the Holy Land beyond the sea.
All 6 kneeled to the assembly in tears, until Doge Enrico Dandolo delivered the official Venetian reply. Venice assisted the expedition under the condition that they accept a debt of 85,000 marks, the equivalent of 20,000 kilograms of silver. Neither the King of England nor of France generated such an amount annually. As a matter of fact, it would take them nearly 2 years to reach such a sum, and that only if they didn't spend an ounce on anything. Yet, the oligarchy contracted that the debt should be paid within a year. The fools signed Satan's contract, and the result was as Venice expected. The chivalry failed to meet the demands of the contract. The rulers of finance proceeded to utilize their new debt slaves to fulfill the task the empire desired: unchallenged maritime control of the East. Ostensibly, the Venetians only required them to retake their ports in Dalmatia from the Christian kingdom of Hungary. But within a matter of months, Venice's real plot came into effect. By the spring of 1202, 40,000 crusaders, 440 large ships, with 50 galleys were on a direct course towards Constantinople. Upon arrival, as the city walls and gates were broken open, the dogs of war were unleashed, destroying everything, looting from the altars of churches, melting the great statue of Hercules for its bronze, and raping every woman in sight, nuns included. Dandolo and the Venetian fleets kept back, watching their dogs ravish the city. They wanted one thing: the islands and the coasts necessary for their maritime empire, and none amongst the Normans hesitated to grant Venice her desires. Her greatest rival in the Mediterranean was annihilated, and her choices of emperor and patriarch, those who would protect Venetian interests, were appointed. This doge had served the oligarchy well, for Venetian voyages could now continue uninterrupted. With their reassurance of complete maritime dominance, the Venetian oligarchy used their power over the Mediterranean to internationally centralize the control and organization of money within their financial empire. Shortly after the raids in Constantinople, Venice dictated that all exchange of silver and gold bullion could only lawfully occur within her lagoon. Bullion ships sailed twice a year from the imperial center to keep this private market flowing. Through this method, Venice sucked Europe dry of its 500-year-old silver standard and enforced a gold standard upon them. The Venetian gold ducat, minted in 1284 of October 31st, became the lawful currency of international trade. Simultaneously, with the assistance of the Mongolian hordes, Venice forced China and India off their gold standard and forced upon them instead Europe's silver for the wealthy and paper for the poor. Thus, no country could produce bullion for its own use, and all currency exchange had to take place in Venice. During this same interval, the Venetian financial tyranny saw the rise to power of their junior partners in Florence, the family banking houses of the Acciaioli, the Peruzzi, and the House of Bardi, then the largest banking house on the planet. These, among others, were the banks that privatized the revenues of states by providing the usurious loans to most of the kingdoms in Europe and southern Italy. Although they wielded significant power, they were merely practicing the usury and financial speculation which the Venetian-dominated monetary system required. They were loan sharks swimming within a Venetian sea. The floating exchange rate between silver and gold bullion, controlled by the Venetian oligarchy, caused even the gold florian, minted by the Florentine bankers, to devalue to worthlessness. Nevertheless, the Florentine parasites served their master well until they became disposable.
They are lending money to the major houses of Europe, the nations, or what passed for nations at that point, the kingdom, various kingdoms and duchies and things like that. And so they get them into debt. Now, for example, the King of England was in significant debt to the Lombard bankers, which was the Venetian banking system, and in particular to the House of Bardi. And so the king, pledged as collateral the wool production of his kingdom. And then, of course, he's going broke, and so he needs more money, so he borrows more money, and then he pledges all of the sheep as well. The key thing about this kind of debt farming, is that once you incur a debt, the debt never really goes away, because they're the interest rates that you have to pay, the money that you have to pay to service this debt is such that you quit building your country and you start trying to pay your debt. And then you have to borrow more money to pay your debt because you get further behind, and then your interest rates get higher, your debt service becomes more, and you set off on a process that never really ends until everything blows up. But that's the Venetian method of control. And that method has not changed since the days of Venice.
While generating profits of 2/3 on all investments in Europe, the Peruzzi, the House of Bardi, and the others would lure in new debt slaves through the yearly champagne fairs in France, using luxury goods imported from Asia as bait. By the beginning of the 14th century, these Lombard bankers were able to insinuate themselves so far into the administrations of both King Edward II and Edward III of England that they ran the king's personal finances, privatized England's revenues, and then charged England for their services. As part of this business, they convinced foolish Edward III to claim France as part of his kingdom, enticing him to spark the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, the Peruzzi Bank, through the Franzesi bankers, provided the financial services for King Philip IV of France. Thus, through keeping the population in a state of bestiality and manipulating stupid people into wars, the Venetians kept their financial empire on top of the world. But with this practice of monetarism, significant productivity was abandoned and the body of the state was sucked to the bare bone. The production of wool in England, Flanders, and Spain collapsed. Because of depreciating farmland and equipment, food crises broke out, resulting in repeated famine within the 1310s, 20s, and 30s. The nature of the system caused farmers to go bankrupt, forcing them to hand over their lands to the bankers. For lack of funds and neglect, bridge construction halted, while those built the century before were left to rot. Sanitation was a joke. Monasteries ceased educating the young, and population levels dropped as the system drove further and further towards bankruptcy. The fleas had consumed all the blood of their host. The city of Florence went bankrupt in 1342, and the banking houses of the Acciaioli and the Buonaccorsi followed suit. The Kingdom of France went bankrupt in 1337, and Edward III's England followed suit in 1340. With the fall of these two kingdoms, and Venice playing currencies against each other, the Peruzzi fell bankrupt themselves in 1345, and within the same year, the top bank on the planet, the House of Bardi, finally collapsed. The entire monetary financial system of the 14th century had now entered its phase of complete disintegration. With no legitimate system found to replace the failed one, the conditions were set to pave the way for the great calamity that was about to fall upon Europe. It had already killed 10 million in China, and over the next 2 generations, the combination of plague, social upheavals, and wars wiped out 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. The empire had brought about the death that its existence promised.
Well, the 100 Years' War eventually wore out. It was a process where society simply disintegrated to such an extent that nobody was in charge. And the whole world became essentially a terra incognita. Now, how did the world come out of that? Well, first of all, you had Dante, who was earlier, but the memory of him and his writings remained. Then the next very important human thinker was Petrarca, who, apart from being an excellent poet, he really re-established this method of going back to the original writings of the humanists. Now, Petrarca had come across Plato indirectly by reading Augustinus, and he immediately recognized how important Plato must have been, but there were no writings of Plato available in Europe at that time. But the most important thing was that Petrarca established this method of going back to the original writings of the humanists. So then the next important element was that around the turn of the century in 1500, there were important artists emerging in the city-states in Italy, in Florence and other cities, and they started to build very remarkable sculptures, paintings, and so forth. But the real Renaissance would not have happened without the Council of Florence. And there in particular it was the work and contribution of Nicolaus of Cusa, who, even if he did not participate directly in the council because he was regarded to be too young at that point, he did the important groundwork which led to the success of the Council of Florence, which was the unification of the Roman Church and the Orthodox Church.
For over 4 generations, with no legitimate system in place, the world continued to be dominated by wars and plagues, until European civilization rose out of its degenerate state through the direction of a minority grouping in society which upheld human creativity as their organizing principle. From Constantinople, Florence, and Padua, this growing impulse reintroduced knowledge of the powers of the human imagination into society. As early as the 1370s, an old Dutchman, Gerard Groot, with his associate, gathered a number of young clerks and copyists to form the Brothers of the Common Life. The devotion of this community was mainly the education of poor orphan children. These children were led to work through the original classical manuscripts as they copied them by hand. Through this method, which was Petrarch's method of study, placing emphasis upon the use of primary sources, the students were prompted to replicate the mental experience of the discovery within their own minds. Thus, the Grootian order encouraged the learning of Greek and Latin, but they also emphasized the teaching of vernacular languages, an emphasis which Dante Alighieri had made nearly a century before. Dante hypothesized that the creation of a literate form of vernacular language common to the entire nation were a necessary precondition for the intellectual growth of a people and for the development of its capacity to exercise self-government. At the beginning of the 15th century, the order expanded its operation from Deventer through the Netherlands and Germany, contributing significantly to the education of 95% of the population, people who were otherwise viewed as feudal serfs. Directly influenced and educated by the circles of the common life, Nicholas of Cusa arose as the most powerful thinker of the century, becoming the leading proponent of a Promethean mission. Through his intellectual contributions, he developed the guiding conceptions of all competent expressions of modern science. For Cusa not only assimilated the minds of the ancient great thinkers, such as Plato, St. Augustine, and Archimedes, but made original breakthroughs in epistemology.
He immediately understood how devastating scholasticism was, which was dominating the universities at that time, and how evil was the influence of Aristotelianism. So in his next work, the Doctor Ignorantia, and many other of his writings, he fought especially against Aristotelian thinking, and he developed the method of the coincidentia oppositorum, which means the coincidence of opposites. Now, he was very much aware that this was a fundamental new thinking and that he was the beginning thinker of a new epoch. He actually said, I'm writing something and I'm saying something which has never been said before. And it was this idea of the coincidentia oppositorum, namely that, unlike Aristotle, who basically said that every progress or everything results out of contradiction, something cannot be A and non-A, Nicolaus developed this idea that you have a higher level in which the one enfolds all which later unfolds in a lawful process. that the one has a higher magnitude than the many. And that approach also enabled him, for example, to solve the paradox of Archimedes and his failed efforts of the quadrature of the circle, simply because Nicolaus recognized that the circle was of a higher order and a higher power than the quadrature or the quadrat. And actually, Nicolaus solved this problem by riding on a horseback from Rome to Brixen, discussing with other mathematicians about this problem.
Whatever is not truth cannot measure truth precisely. By comparison, a non-circle cannot measure a circle whose being is something indivisible. Hence, the intellect, which is not truth, never comprehends truth so precisely that truth cannot be comprehended infinitely more precisely. For the intellect is to truth as an inscribed polygon is to the inscribing circle. The more angles the inscribed polygon has, the more similar it is to the circle. However, even if the number of its angles is increased ad infinitum, the polygon never becomes equal to the circle unless it is resolved into an identity with the circle.
So then, naturally, out of this, he developed many other very important concepts. He developed the first scientific measurement. He developed the idea of the coincidence of macrocosm and microcosm by basically saying the only reason why man can know the laws of the universe, the laws of creation, is because his mind must follow the same lawfulness like the laws of the universe, because otherwise how could something immaterial like the mind, thinking in terms of ideas, comprehend real physical things in the real universe? So then naturally out of this came also the idea that he found the proof of the immortality of the soul by saying that given the fact that the place where all the sciences are created, mathematics, geography, music, and all the other sciences, they are created by the soul, and they are obviously immortal because once they are created, they remain. But if the soul can create immortal things, and obviously that which creates is of a higher order than what is created, that means that also the soul must be immortal.
For centuries, the Venetian Empire and the descendants of the empire's monetary system had used the dog Aristotle to eliminate the idea that man was creative and therefore capable of changing the universe. Nicholas of Cusa discredited these Aristotelian attempts to suppress creativity, and for the moment caused Aristotelian thinking to lose its place in society.
Well, there's basically two things you got to think about. One is that Cusa excommunicated Aristotle from science, or at least he initiated that. Aristotle constructed this cosmology, which was really sort of a souped-up version of an old Babylonian myth, that you have the earth here in the center, which is the way sense perception portrays the universe to you. The earth is at the center, and everything around you is arrayed in a big sphere. And when you look at the characteristic of this organization of the universe, the characteristic is that the closer you get to the center, the more things are changing. And the farther away you get from the center, the less things change. So Aristotle's argument was that the good is the unchanging part, which is beyond all sense perception, and the bad is in the center where everything is changing. And the only way to become good is to die and stop changing. So this was Aristotle's idea. Cusa took this head on in many different ways. He took it on directly by saying that that's not the way the universe works. The universe is not a fixed state as sense perception makes it appear to be, where you have a center and a circumference which are separated and opposite. But in truth, Cusa said, the universe is a single whole that is always changing everywhere. It's the earliest development of the idea of what Einstein later calls a universe which is finite and unlimited, finite and unbounded. It's a whole. There's nothing outside the universe, but it has an unlimited potential for self-perfectibility, as Cusa put it.
We see that by the gift of God there is present in all things a natural desire to exist in the best manner in which the condition of each thing's nature permits this. And we see that all things act toward this end and have instruments adopted thereto. They have an innate sense of judgment which serves the purpose of knowing. They have this in order that their desire not be in vain, but be able to attain the rest in that respective object which is desired by the propensity of each thing's own nature, since all things exist in the best way they are able to exist.
With his developing intellectual might, Cusa, as a priest and then as a cardinal, devoted his life to ensure that the narrow pathway that leads to truth could be found by many. He extended his anti-Aristotelian scientific understandings to the relationship among God, man, and the universe, to the problem of unifying the Eastern Orthodox and Western Roman churches. In this endeavor, he persistently insisted that the unification occur through the acceptance of the concept of the filioque, that creativity emanates from both God the Father and God the Son to mankind, which was the biggest source of controversy between the two. 2 decades before getting involved in organizing for the Council of Florence, Cusa participated at the Council of Constance, the conference that ended the strife caused by 3 popes who all claimed to be the legitimate head of the Catholic Church. During the session there, Nicholas befriended the rising Platonist Cosimo de' Medici. After the Council of Constance, Cusa carried on his studies at the University of Padua, surrounding himself with the city's top intellectuals, such as Giuliano Cesarini and Ambrogio Traversari, who translated the works of Plato and Aristotle, provoking profound debates about the good, the value of poetry, and the nature of the community. Coincidentally, in Padua, he met and began a lifelong friendship with Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, with whom in later years he would engage in deep dialogue about mapping and geography. Through this friendship, Cusa also became acquainted with the great artists Leone Battista Alberti and Filippo Brunelleschi. Such was the environment of his thinking. His first application of his intellectual understanding to a significant political problem occurred at the Council of Basel, the first council set up to address unification with the Eastern Greek churches. Though at Basel, one could only find deep corruption and haughtiness. This situation forced Pope Eugene IV, a friend of Cusa, to move the discussion to Ferrara, a location that enabled the Pope to participate directly in dialogue with the Greeks. Cusa, as part of a minority delegation, left Basel and traveled directly to Constantinople in order to recruit a Greek contingency that would participate. During his stay, he successfully located crucial documents proving that the formulation of the filioque had been part of the creed in the early councils, when the 2 churches were one. With those documents and his ingenuity, Cusa and his comrades sailed to Ferrara with 700 representatives of the church and scholars, including the Patriarch and the Byzantine Emperor. Soon, the council in Ferrara would shift its location to Florence. Though the Council of Basel was a farce, Cusa had constructed an idea of the principle that would underlie the formation of the modern nation-state while there. His political thinking was not limited to questions about the church. The church was merely that upon which he could immediately act. In the process of convincing the unification of the 2 churches, he developed a clear idea of the political formation of the nation, which had not existed since Dante Alighieri. At Basel, Nicholas devoted the working of his mind to the principles of natural law by which a state must be governed.
All legitimate power arises from elective concordance and free submission. There is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that the authority, which comes from God as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of the subjects. One who is established in authority as representative of the will of all may be called a public or a common person, the father of all, ruling without haughtiness or pride, in a lawful and legitimately established government. While recognizing himself as a creature, as it were, of all his subjects as a collectivity, let him act as their father as individuals. That is the divinely ordained marital state of spiritual union based on a lasting harmony by which a commonwealth is best guided in the fullness of peace toward the good of eternal bliss.
If you're going to accomplish anything good, you have to destroy evil. And you had this evil system which had dominated civilization, despite the fact that people were fighting against it in rearguard actions. And you had some breakthroughs. I mentioned earlier that Cusa was building on the foundation that was laid by Dante earlier, who made a tremendous advance for mankind in fighting for this idea. The problem is that the power, the political power of the empire oligarchy, whether it was the landed aristocracy or whether it was this newer financial aristocracy represented by the Venetian Empire, which used not land, but control of the seas, control of trade, control of finance, control of insurance, intelligence, this kind of thing, to maintain this fixed order in society.
Finally, the idea of a representative system as conceived by Dante earlier in defiance of oligarchy was definitively stated, in which elected representatives enter a reciprocal legal relationship with both the government and the governed. This would be the institutional function of a sovereign nation-state republic.
Human beings have built cities and adopted laws to preserve unity and harmony, and they established guardians of all of these laws with the power necessary to provide for the general welfare. For this purpose, the ruler should have the best qualified of his subjects chosen from all parts of his realm to participate in a daily council with him. These counselors ought to represent all the inhabitants of the realm. These counselors ought constantly to defend the good of the public which they represent, giving advice and serving as the appropriate means through which the king can govern and influence his subjects, and the subjects on proper occasion can influence him in return. The great strength of the kingdom comes from this daily council. The counselors should be appointed to this task by agreement in a general meeting of the kingdom, and they should be publicly bound legally by oath to speak out openly for the public good.
Although not adopted in full by the councils, the concept of a modern nation-state had now been born, a light for all souls who had walked and would yet walk the earth. In Florence, the council proclaimed, "Let the heavens rejoice in Brunelleschi's dome," as the churches of East and West finally unified under the Filioque, thanks to the documents acquired by Cusa. The Greeks that Nicholas had organized brought to Florence the complete dialogues of Plato, marking the day when Europe had finally revived the great thoughts that represented the highest intellectual achievements of Athens. The works of Plato predominated all discussions in Florence, inspiring Cosimo de' Medici to found the first Platonic academy in modern Europe. With an atmosphere susceptible to cognitive thinking, these great works spread like wildfire amongst the commons, paving the way for the emergence of the Italian Golden Renaissance of the 15th century. Such an environment brought forth a higher density of creative thinking, expressed through further investigations of physical science, the promotion of bel canto singing, and all other arts. Pacioli and Leonardo da Vinci would rise as the leading promoters of that society, contributing further to the development of mankind with paintings that reflected the aesthetical nature of man and his inventions. With the affirmation by Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa of this new form of government, the first modern sovereign nation-state rose under Louis XI of France, who in turn was also under the influence of the Brothers of the Common Life. Henry VII soon followed his suit, establishing his own sovereign government in England with the overthrow of that tyrannical Richard III. Louis XI asserted a system above the system of empire, implementing taxes in the form of tariffs that increased overall production, protecting and encouraging the harvest of wheat and other agriculture, while increasing the mining of resources. He broke the power of the feudal lords over the people by abolishing private warfare. Before his death, Louis XI would write the rose bush of the war for his son, to ensure that the common good of the people and nation were upheld as of the most important function of a ruler. There he summarized the responsibilities of a ruler as he wrote,
"Each should seek to have a good soul, and not put his heart too much in the world or its goods, which he must leave finally behind. This passage will pass all valiant warriors, all wise men, all saints, and those who from Adam and Eve descended and will descend, none remaining, but only the renown of their acts will remain. Thus the prince must provide for maintenance of public works and edifices, to improve and repair roads, bridges, the ports, the walls, the moats, and the other things in his towns and castles, which are necessary for the care of his people."
But these achievements could only go so far. In the latter part of his years, it became evident to Cuza that the culture of Europe was heavily corrupted by oligarchism. He understood that the degeneracy of the population was so deep that any form of human progress that took place on the continent would have its limit. He forecast rightfully, for the events of the coming years, long after the Council of Florence, proved that Europe was too weak to preserve the best of its own culture. Foreseeing that Europeans would succumb to this cultural manipulation of the oligarchy, Nicholas conspired with his lifelong friends Paolo Toscanelli and Fernão Martins to flank this predictable self-destruction by traveling west off the coasts of the European continent in search of lands in which civilization could settle and develop freely away from the corruption of Europe. Before they could find a way to accomplish this, Cuza died. His two most intimate friends were with him, signing his last testament on August 6, 1464, standing by his bedside and comforting their dying friend until he finally departed 5 days later. Toscanelli and Martins ensured that Nicholas of Cuza had not lived in vain by working to make his dream a reality. Finally, after rigorous searching, Martins became acquainted with the young future admiral Cristofer Columbus and befriended him in the 1470s. The two spoke much to each other, and during the course of dialogue, Martins introduced the admiral to the plot that he, Toscanelli, and Cuza had previously discussed. Thereafter, he brought Columbus into direct correspondence with Toscanelli, in which the admiral was given access to all of Toscanelli's works, including a map that would guide him safely to achieve Cuza's mission.
A master, Paolo Toscanelli, a Florentine contemporary to the same admiral, was the cause in great measure of his undertaking this voyage with greater spirit. The fact that the cited Paolo was a friend of Fernão Martins, and that the two were writing letters to each other about the sea voyages made to the country of Guinea during the time of King Alfonso of Portugal, and about what could be done in the westward direction, came to the ears of the admiral, who was most curious about these things. And he hastened to write to the said Master Paolo about this, and sent to him an armillary sphere, revealing to him his intent.
And Nicholas of Cuza had specified crossing the oceans to save European civilization by taking it, the best part of it, across the oceans, away from Europe, then build it up and bring it back into Europe. That was his policy. So, and Christopher Columbus made his voyage across the Atlantic on the basis of the writings of Nicholas of Cuza and the files. And this occurred about 1480, 1492, of course, he crossed the ocean. But Columbus's first voyage, the purpose behind it, the drive, was the colonization of North America in particular, but also the Americas more generally, but North America in particular, as a place to take European civilization, get the hell away from Europe and the corruption of the oligarchical traditions of Europe, the reactionary traditions, and take the best of European civilization, transplant it into the Americas, and then build up the culture, and then return to Europe and try to bring Europe back into some sensible operation. So that's the general span of the story.
28 years after Nicholas of Cusa had deceased, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic to discover the New World, while, in Europe, a decree was dictated to the Spanish monarchy by the Grand Inquisitor, expelling all Muslims and Jews from the country unless they accepted the religion of the Inquisition. All those who refused were subjected to persecution and public humiliation, arrested, and then tortured. In 1508, the League of Cambrai was formed among the significant powers of Western Europe, including Louis XI's heir to the throne and his admirer, Henry VII of England, in an attempt to destroy the monetarist empire still centered in Venice. But with Henry VII's death the following year, and the complicity of the current pope of the time to the Venetians, the League was dissolved. Starting with the Inquisition, and continuing with the promotion of Luther and the Reformation generally, and then supporting the Catholic Church's counter-Reformation, the Venetian Empire had been busy lighting the fuse for religious conflicts throughout Europe. Eventually, among others, they deployed their agent Friar Zorzi to England to manipulate the new king, Henry VIII. They used him to further feed the ongoing frenzy of religious wars by driving him to assume the authority to reform the church in England so he could meet his sexual desires. Fearing the former alliance which sought to destroy the devil, the oligarchy proceeded to move north in search of a new capital from which to operate. They settled throughout northern Europe, opening their first major headquarters in Amsterdam, Holland. Centuries later, they consolidated their true base in 1763, upholding their public political headquarters in London, which remains still today, yet with their satanic souls continuing to reside in Venice. But this shift to the north was not enough. The scientific achievements of Nicholas of Cusa and the Renaissance crippled the era of Aristotle, making his methods worthless to the oligarchy. The creative impulses of the Golden Age caused an explosion of discoveries and innovations which society was not willing to give up. Venice, then the center of the empire, had no choice but to adapt to those conditions, and thus the doctrines of the Venetian Paolo Sarpi came forth, founding what would become modern British liberalism. This new method of the oligarchy allowed innovation, while suppressing creative thinking. It said yes to technology, but no to creativity.
Now, against the emergence of the city, that Venetian faction was not able to prevail successfully against the modern nation state. The modern nation state went on and kept living. So Sarpi said, I have a solution for this. He's against the modern nation state in a sense. But he says, you can't do this. You've got to allow innovation, some inventions, new technologies. You've got to allow that. You just cannot allow that to become science. In other words, it can become techniques, but not scientific principle. The same thing is, again, the principle of the Olympian Zeus. Mankind cannot discover physical principles. Mankind can be allowed to make a few little innocent innovations. And so, therefore, this becomes then liberalism. The philosophy of liberalism is you are now allowed to innovate under conditions, if the government allows it. But you cannot discover or teach the universal principles which underlie these technologies. So that gave us a society, like an English society, a European society, in which science as such is often not allowed. What is called science is mathematics, that you are allowed to have a formula to describe a technique, but not to discover or understand the principle which underlies the success of that technique. So that became the liberal system and became modern empiricism and all the things that go with that.
While the hopes of Henry VII and Louis XI for a sovereign nation-state were destroyed, a band of humanists following in the footsteps of Columbus, set sail for the New World, reaching the shores at Plymouth. They sailed, acting upon the same intent Cusa's friends had instilled within Columbus. With their arrival, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the realization of his mission was accomplished. Our flesh makes us mortal, but our spirits immortal. It is true, one day, each of us will all die. But will we die wretched like those of collapsed societies? Or will our deaths have been a triumph for those living beyond our times? That choice belongs to you. And if you can make that righteous choice, then perhaps our civilization today and those of the future might have a chance to live in an aesthetical world, a world in which the fostering and nourishing of man's inner beauty becomes the meaning of our existence, where we recognize ourselves not as beasts, but as creatures of reason, endowed with that divine intellect as intended by our Creator. This can be our world, and perhaps someday our solar system, if you can make that choice. If you become a defender of justice, if you embrace compassion as your dearest friend, if truth be your brother. Victory is not guaranteed. But what is guaranteed is that if we fail in redirecting the course of current affairs, that mankind will fall into the darkest of dark ages history will ever know.
you.